All right. We are up and running on both YouTube and Discord with the right camera for once. Finally, last one of the semester that actually works. Well, welcome y'all. Hope you had a good weekend. We are reaching it. So to wrap this semester up, what do y'all say? Let's do this thing. Yay. Why, yes, I did come in here after class on Wednesday, and it's pretty good. I literally just, for like 45 minutes.
How many marks did you take?
2. And if you'll notice, I didn't do that chunk. Like, you can see where I stopped. It's like, I can't do this. But it works, so better than none. All right. We are finishing up talking about space politics today. Yeah, the board basically looks brand new at this point, especially compared to last class. I mean, Jesus, like I couldn't stand it anymore. Here, let me drop you the. Oh, already did. Never mind. Already dropped it. All right. So today we are wrapping things up. We're going to talk about conflict in and through space. So the equivalent of international relations, but in a space civilization context. Before we do that, though, I just want to briefly let you all know, I did look at your outlines. They were all fine, so there's a reason why you didn't hear back to me. Like, luckily, they're looking good. Wednesday, we are going to present briefly our papers, right? I'm going to give you each about 10 minutes to cover your question, how you are approaching to answer it, and kind of what the big answer you come up with is. I know we've all kind of refocused the papers across the course of the semester. And I also want the draft, I want the final government constitution in Wednesday, but it seems like I pretty much had that wrapped a couple weeks ago. So we should be in a good direction for that. Any end of the semester housekeeping stuff before we dive in to space conflict? All right, well, the ultimate thing for us to deal with, right, this is going to be the last big question to deal with, is this idea of conflict in and through space. So, when it comes down to it, the big thing that we need to remember for not just this particular question, the larger question about conflict in general is, why does conflict happen? And then moving on from why does conflict occur, I want to get towards, well, how does conflict occur, right? Because conflict is more than just fighting about stuff, and we'll get to that in a bit. But I want to first start off, why do we have conflicts between political entities, right? Why does conflict happen? Yeah.
Well, usually what's happening right now over in Europe is because one building doesn't have enough for, I want to say, what they want to do, like resources wise, so they want to push out to another political entity.
So conflict occurs over resources. What else do we have? Yeah.
Human nature.
Human nature, right? That's going to be part of this, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than just we fight because that's what we do. But I do think that the human nature approach reveals something a little bit more interesting. We resort to conflict from human nature when we have disagreements over outcomes. Right? Going back to Russia Russia-Ukraine thing right now. If Russia and Ukraine both agreed that Russia was so much more powerful that they were just going to roll in 3 days and take over everything, would Ukraine have actually fought? I mean, they would have probably given up some sort of token conflict, but right, for some reason, the Ukrainians believed that they could, at the very least, halt Russian progress, much less maybe even win this war. There ended up being a disagreement over what both sides thought the outcome would be. Right? And when that occurs, that's when you actually see more and more conflict. Right? So you fight over resources, you fight because you disagree about outcomes. Right? We do see some identity things. We fight because we're different. And we fight because we're not sure about what both sides actually want. So communication breakdown. Right, these are all classic international relations things, right? So the point where we're starting from is that all of those theories we have about international relations, all that stuff we know, there's no reason why it doesn't apply. Right? We spent a good chunk of last class establishing that geopolitics can pretty readily be extended into the realm of space, right? The same metaphors, the same realities apply. So we're kind of taking a step back and talking about the meta causes of conflict today. So these are kind of the big things, right? Disagreement over resources, who controls them, disagreement over what the outcome of a conflict would be, breakdown in communication, etc. So then the next step. And again, you can spend an entire semester just doing this. We're compressing, moving on. So how does conflict occur? Right? How do we do conflict? I mean, obviously the big one, we fight. We actually do military actions. But what are some other realms where we do conflict? Or perhaps conflict resolution as well? That's our hard power, but there's some other avenues.
Like summits and stuff like that?
Right, so we'll just generally call diplomacy. You talk it out. Or you do it via trade. Or the other option, right? Clandestine activity. Conflict is more than just the fight on the field, right? There's more that goes into it, right? There's discussions, there's arguments, there's economic activity, there's the spy stuff, right? The stuff that kind of is in the gray world there. All of these things play a role in the way that you conduct conflict. Now, if you want to take that one step further and start to apply this directly to space issues, right? Then we're going to talk about realms of conflict. So in traditional conflict, right, we're talking about air, land, sea, cyber, right? That's the stuff we did last class. We didn't extend this into space, right? We didn't talk about where conflict happens within outer space, right? This is a little bit more, this is where things do go in a more complicated and different direction than even traditional conflicts, right? So we're going to put up a basic map of the solar system here real quick. Orbits not to scale. And also remember, this is a three-dimensional plane. That's going to be important as well. But it's really hard to do this in 3 dimensions. Right? That's going to be where space conflict gets funky. And we'll go all the way out to Jupiter. So this is the realm of conflict, right? You can essentially treat each planet not as a single space, right? A single dot, right? When we think of planets, we're thinking specifically of the planet itself, right? But there's more to it than that, right? Each planet exists within an orbit. They each have an orbital zone. And outside of that orbital zone, or rather within that orbital zone, they also have not the orbital zone around the sun, but also the planetary orbital zone. So thus far, our thoughts about space conflict have been more in the through space variety, right? Talking about extending conflict into essentially our own planetary orbital zone, maybe as far out as the moon's orbit, right? When we think of Earth, right, that's really kind of the farthest we think about our system. But around each planet, right, you have Lagrange points, which are stable orbits. So if we look at the Earth-Moon system, right, you would have Lagrange points right, up to 6 of them just between the Earth and the Moon. And then between the Moon, between Earth and the Sun, you'll have another set of Lagrange points. These are going to be parts of it. So I think that the first big expansion in thinking about planets, right, as the primary actor within a solar system, right, within a settled solar system, is you actually need to move beyond thinking about just the planetary orbital zones, right, that are inclusive of Lagrange points, and instead start thinking of them as sovereign orbital spheres. So instead of thinking of Earth as just the dot, we should begin to think of Earth as the entire torus of its orbit, especially in a conflict scenario. Because if you wanted, right, this is going back to the very beginning when we were talking about like shifting between planes to get to Mars. This is the opposite direction of it. If you want to attack Earth, right, the easiest way to do that is to throw something at it along its orbit. We're really bad at just looking at kind of our small orbital sphere. We don't see what's coming up further down the road. Right? And if you can come at it from an eccentric orbit, right, find a way to get at it not from within the plane of the ecliptic, but say over the plane of the ecliptic or under the plane of the ecliptic, currently that makes it a much easier target to hit. Right? Now follow me so far. So the first expansion that really needs to happen is realizing that not only is the realm of conflict more than just the planetary orbit, right? It's actually about the toroid, right? The torus, the donut of the orbit, the whole thing around the sun. And that gets us to this question of what should be sovereign, right? What should sovereignty look like? So much like nations on Earth have claims, right? Sovereign claims to their territorial waters and to the atmosphere above their states. I think that we should consider looking at the sovereignty of planets as the full area of their orbits. Right? We could perhaps think of it more like territorial waters. So within international maritime law, states can claim a certain amount of water past their borders, right, off their shore, as exclusively theirs, right? Like it is literally our territory. It's 3 miles. So 3 miles off of the coast, wherever that furthest point is where the United States ends, right? But it's also extended to a zone of economic exclusion, meaning that only you can use that land out to the edge of the continental shelf, right, where you are. So you get a further area. So in many ways, I think we can extend that model to encompass both of these, right? The planetary orbit is the planet, right? That is what it is, right? It's gravity well, including as far out as its furthest moon is exclusively that planet. And then it has kind of an exclusionary zone, right? A safety zone of sovereignty around it that includes its entire orbit. Now you can traverse through it, right? There's no problem through that, but they do have a vested interest in keeping their orbit clear, right? Clearing its, right, each orbit. So gravity well, which includes the Lagrange points and any moons, is exclusive. And that would be how you would define what the planet itself is its entire well, its entire system. And then you get to the solar orbit. That's kind of your zone of sovereignty, your sovereign zone. So that's really the area that you were talking about protecting. Right? If you're talking about conflict, you're talking about conflict between those different areas. So with me so far? This makes sense, right? In much the same way that countries want to protect their economic access to the seas as well as their actual coastal borders, I think the same thing can be applied with planetary orbits, right? As kind of the way to think about this conflict, right? The way that conflict would play out. So you would have access exclusively to use your own orbit as well as your solar orbit, but that solar orbit's a lot, right? You basically have to allow people to transit, to move between different areas. Where things get questionable is when we're talking about the belt, right? And that's going to be a real bitch to figure out legally, right? Just because everybody's going to want, that's where the real economic opportunity is, right? Where the true resources are. And the model that you have of a single planet's orbit, maybe it's just whoever gets to that body first gets to claim it and use it however they want. But that one, right, we're punting that, okay? I'm gonna let you know we're punting that one right now. So let's get to the next step of this, right? This is where conflict would occur, would be along these solar orbits. Let's take the center out for now. Venus and Mercury still exist. They're there. It's going to take them out to clear up our border. We'll keep the sun. It's nice. Keeps us warm.
So it blows up.
So it blows up and we all, yeah. But we should be in different planetary systems by then. And that's billions of years down the road. We probably won't even be humans if we continue to exist. All right. So this is really the sun we're talking about. Now, when conflict inevitably occurs, now, because I think it's pretty likely that you would see some sort of conflict emerge. That is part of our human nature, it's part of our history. As much as we want to forestall it to begin with, right, that argument for making Mars a sovereign entity to begin with, there's probably going to be some level of conflict in space and through space in the future. It's right? There is truth to what Hannah said, that's what we are. We do have that part of our human nature. And right, communication will break down, and right, all of these things are still going to matter. Because eventually, Earth and Mars are going to make claims about resources in the belt or further, and there's going to be some sort of conflict over it. Now, it's kind of dumb that there will be, because they're literally just go get to the next asteroid. There's so much of it out there anyway. Right? There's more than our economic activity can even handle to introduce, but we're just going to put the human nature of it all in there and assume, I think it's a pretty safe assumption, eventually they're going to end up being some conflict between Earth and Mars. So, what does this conflict look like? Right? How do you actually have conflict in space? So let's work with the currently foreseeable level of technology we have and think about what a conflict looks like there, and then maybe we can advance the technology a couple hundred years and get us to more constant acceleration and deceleration that changes the nature of the conflict. Right? So let's take what we've got now first. So currently, in order to move things between Earth and Mars, that requires chemical rockets. You're pretty slow, right? This is not fast conflict. This is pretty slow if you were going to do that. If Earth and Mars were to get into conflict with each other 20 years from now, that looks vastly different than the way it would in science fiction, right? So what do we have available to us if we have chemical rockets as our primary method of propulsion? Are we going to be throwing missiles at each other between Earth and Mars? I mean, really?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, but like, if what we have is our current level of technology plus maybe a couple of decades of development in rocketry, that's going to be pretty obvious, right? And then what can you throw between Earth and Mars that could have a viable impact and conflict? We're not getting to throwing rocks yet, because that's inevitably where this goes. If we're stuck with this current level of technology, what you do is you throw asteroids at each other. But if you don't get up to that level quite so much, then how do you bomb Earth from Mars without asteroids? That's where this goes.
I was just curious if you heard of the Orion project from the 60s.
Oh, using nuclear weapons to accelerate spaceships.
Yeah, they designed a battleship that the U.S. Air Force was operating, and it's like included like naval guns and like space fighters. It's like a real thing.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And right, that's kind of where we're going to go with it, right? We could maybe do nuclear propulsion, but it's a tough one to do, because you have to use a nuclear bomb every time right on your pressure plate to accelerate you, and then you're launching space fighter. We'll get to ship-to-ship combat a bit, right? It's tough to do. So right now, with the technology and the tech tree we went down, maybe what you throw is tungsten rods at each other, maybe nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, probably not, just because there's survivability of reentry and how effective would they really be. You can see that, right? The problem with all this is you can see it coming, right? It's pretty easy to see where things are going to go. You either need to essentially precede it along the orbit or close to it in a parallel but intersecting orbit, and then you can make the choice to drop it into orbit. And you can do the math on all that. It's very good. You can predict all that. You know exactly how Earth's going to spin and what direction it's going to go and where it's going to be. You can precede all that, and Earth can do the same thing to Mars. But at that point, right, you might as well just do a full asteroid, right? You can't really do a surgical strike like this.
Okay, so like, my thing is that unless like something major happens, I feel like this like method of conflict is kind of too costly and just not realistic. To me, it'd be more like cyber stuff.
Yeah.
Which I'm guessing we'll probably get there eventually.
I mean, the only really viable thing you have for actual conflict between Earth and Mars, given relatively close to what we have technology-wise, is you redirect asteroids at each other. And the cost on that is way too high. Like literally destroying, making planets unlivable. That's not to say it wouldn't happen. God, I hope that one doesn't happen. But that, right, that's kind of the only viable method of conflict that exists when it comes to actually doing combat. Now I think we need to roll the tech a little bit further ahead to get to the Orion thing, because that idea of propulsion isn't super great, but we'll talk about why. So if you want to actually get kinetic, throwing rocks is about all you got, and that's too costly. You can't actually send troops between Earth and Mars. How long does that take to happen? That takes 18 months to happen. And then if you can already control the high ground, right? I'm not worried about Earth sending an invading army to Mars. Because if Mars can put up just a modicum of planetary defense that you're going to want for asteroids anyway, anything that gets close, you can shoot it out of the sky. So that's not a particularly viable way of doing it. Plus, you can actually see launches across planets if you're observing each other well. So you can theoretically do it if you're on opposite sides of the thing, but then it would be like 3 years to get troops from one planet to the other, right? It is really hard to move troops. So then you're probably talking, which is, thank you for the segue again, Hannah, cyber stuff, right? You try to penetrate each other's communication networks. You can do trade war. Right, cut them off. From economics, although Earth will have a much larger ability to do that to Mars than Mars will to Earth, especially in the early stages. So you're probably actually mostly talking about clandestine activity.
Oh, that would be so fun.
End of point.
To get sent to like space. So, like,
Space spies.
Yeah, you know,
We're talking space spies.
I'll write a book about it or on my iPad or whatever.
So there is a series. I think it's by Justin Posey, something Posey. I think it's Sunbreakers. Right? It's about like Earth and Mars space spies, like half spies, half like special operators. It's kind of fun, but it's further right. It's when a trip between Earth and Mars would be much quicker to do. Right? Here, you basically have to. You'd have to have Mars sympathetic people already on Earth to operate, and then Earth tries to infiltrate Mars with workers and settlers.
That would be great.
Yeah, right. I mean, they do a little bit of that in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, right? There's a little bit of that gets in there, but and it does flow both ways. So for now, this is kind of what you're stuck with. In the earliest goings of this, right? If Earth wants to stop Mars from actually declaring itself independent, what they've got is preventing people from getting there in the first place. And are the Earth nations going to actually shoot down spaceships full of settlers? Like, what does that look like?
Maybe Russia.
I mean, well, Russia, China, but like, if Russia, China, United States, European Union aren't the ones doing it, if it's SpaceX doing it, and right, he decides, okay, we're going to launch these things from international waters, right?
But I think the U.S. wouldn't do it because whoever
Yeah,
pushed that button.
They're not gonna do that.
No.
yeah, right. That is a tough button to push, and that's a tough. I mean, China could push that, right? China and Russia could push that.
People with lower moral codes, definitely.
But even then, do they want to do it? Because they'll probably have their citizens on board as well. And, right,
They don't care about their people.
well, I definitely think we could say that with Russia right now. But I don't know. China, I think, might have a little bit more there. As dirty and gross as China is, they do seem to prefer the diplomatic and persuasion path. So, for now, probably still again because Ukraine's not going very good. So this is kind of what you're stuck with right now, right? Given our current levels of development and technologies, while throwing rocks is out there, it's probably going to be harder for Earth to throw rocks at Mars. Mars would have more access to rocks to throw at Earth and be less costly to do it for Mars. But you're probably actually talking cyber, which even then is going to be tough to do because the networks are while they're going to be connected, there's so much lag that you essentially would have to buffer everything coming through anyway. And it'll be harder to do unless you get actual boots on the ground to do it. So you're more or less stuck with diplomacy and economic activity, which is actually really beneficial for where we are right now. Right? For the earliest going stages of this, that's probably the best possible scenario because it's going to be really hard for Earth and Mars to actually fight each other, given current technologies. Now, if we can speed things up, that's when things are going to get interesting, right? That's getting us to our Orion stuff, that's getting us to the Expanse, right? That's a foreseeable path in the future, right? Being able to constantly accelerate and decelerate. If you can constantly accelerate or decelerate in space, that 18-month transit can drop down to a few weeks, right? That's much more doable. So a few weeks on scales like that, that's where we're starting to get into real interesting things about comedy. Right. So we still have this model going up. Keep that in the back of your minds. We need some more. And again, I have to completely shout out Everett Goldman. Everett Goldman, this is one of the areas that has actually been decently well researched to this point. The one kind of thing that I would bring up to Goldman, my big argument against Goldman, I do say this in my book, is that he doesn't extend it far enough. He wrote his treatise on astropolitics focused on states fighting each other. And even if the states end up doing space settlement, they'll be in conflict with each other for that. It won't be private actors. It won't be an independent and sovereign Mars, which I think he misses a little bit. And that changes the scenario a little bit. I do think creating a sovereign military power of Mars pushes Earth to unite much more heavily. Right? I do think that's one thing that would occur further down the road, but just simple balance of power. So let's up our tech just a little bit. We're going to skip over the Orion thing. The reason why the Orion thing is difficult is because of the amount of essentially damage that the ship's going to take every time you accelerate. And you can only carry so much fuel with you, so you're still not constantly accelerating, right? It takes a nuclear bomb to speed up, and it takes the same nuclear number to slow down. And while you can go faster than you could get with a chemical rocket, the wear and tear on it, right? The pressure push plate either has to be so big that it's hard to build the ship to begin with, or, right, you have to build in so much like shock absorption on the back of your ship that it just, right? And then how close do you want to be to a detonating nuclear bomb, even in space, right? And they're not as efficient because they don't have the like air medium to push off. They're literally relying on the explosion itself. So Orion's not great. It's probably better than chemical rocketry because, well, we can't accelerate or change our stuff in orbit without a full load of fuel anyway. So we're going to move it a little bit further up. We're going to go towards fusion rockets. And that's probably the level of tech. I mean, we're 100, 150 years maybe. I don't know, it depends on, right? If we can actually crack the idea of fusion power this decade, which is a possibility, then this changes the game completely, right? We move towards much faster acceleration and deceleration because you can do it constantly. That's more or less what they're using the Expanse is. They use right their hand waving technology is a more efficient version of the fusion rocket. But if we just like kind of a first stage fusion rocket, so using the fusion reaction, all the energy released for that as your propellant anyway, that allows you to be much more efficient, move much more quickly. Now we're in the realm of ship-to-ship combat, right? Actually doing space combat. This is beyond what we would be doing now, right? Space Force doesn't even have anything on the radar for us, right? Space Force just looks at satellites. That's all they don't even have plans for space astronauts. So we're not even dealing with that. We got to move forward. This is, until we get fusion rocketry, we can't even start thinking about actual space combat, particularly space navies. So what does a space military vessel look like, right? How do you actually build something that can fight in space? What would that space combat look like? But there's going to be a relationship between the tech of what the ship can be and what kind of technologies you have, and then how you actually do the fighting. Right? So assuming we have fusion rocketry, we probably also have something along the lines of, well, we still have cannons. We'll probably have missiles / torpedoes. Probably railguns. And then maybe directed energy weapons, but directed energy weapons might not be as efficient in space as you would want them to be. So space lasers. So that's probably the suite of technology that you have. Yeah.
I'm thinking probably one of the most effective ones would be like EMPs, where it shuts down all the systems.
I mean, that probably would be part of it. But the other side of that is if you're going to be operating in space, you're going to be hardened to radiation anyway. And an EMP might not be effective because, right, you're already building your systems to be ready for radiation. Right? That's really what EMPs do, is they just bombard your systems with radiation, and they shut it down. So there's that's like a shmady. It'd be super great if you could just like hit them with an EMP and the ship dies. That'd be great. But I think you can harden for that. Right? Most of our military hardware at this point is already hardened for it, and we know how to stop it. We know what to do. You essentially just build a Faraday cage around the ship, and it's good to go. So great concept. Actually putting it into practice, probably not as effective. But this gets us towards kind of a suite of technologies that are available. And that's going to direct the way that you fight. Now, the thing to remember, and this is one that's going to get people into trouble in the initial stages of learning how to do space combat. Two things. One, inertia. Right? What's inertia mean? Do you remember basic physics?
Energy keeping you going.
Yes, right. An object in motion will remain in motion until it acted upon in another way. So every bullet you fire, unless it runs into something, is just going to keep going, right? Once you put energy into something, it's going to keep going in that direction. So you can throw a rock way in advance, and it's just going to keep on going, right? You can accelerate something in a single direction, and it's going to keep going at that same velocity. And that's going to matter for both weaponry and the ships themselves. If a ship is moving in a particular direction until it spends energy to move in a different direction, it's going to keep going that way. Right? Which ties in with number 2. Plane changes are expensive. Delta V still matters. Even if you make propulsion way better, changing your direction is still going to be very costly. Acceleration and deceleration still cost a whole lot. Which is especially going to cause problems when you actually get into the combat itself. Because you're going to have set velocities, relative speeds or relative velocities are going to dictate the type of combat. So if you've got 2 spaceships interacting with each other, fighting each other, both their inertia and the planes that they're on and their velocities are going to be really important, right? So if they're coming at each other in roughly the same plane with their imparted velocities, and it's a quick pass, right? If they're going 20,000 miles an hour each, and that's going to be really slow. If that's how fast they're going each, but they're on different velocities, meaning they're going different directions, that's going to mean that the window of combat is going to be extraordinarily short and limited by the weapons that they have. And the speed of light is going to deeply dictate the information that you have, right? So once you start to add in not only velocity changes or velocity differences, but also the fact that you're only going to be able to observe things at the speed of light, you're only going to have knowledge of where things are, not inherently instantaneously. It's going to take a while to observe things, right? You'll see what I'm saying? So the combat itself might be fast, and while you can predict what that trajectory is going to be, if you're on this ship, you know which direction they're going, and you want to use that to your effect, right, to your benefit, you could put something in its way, right? You pre-launch or pre-time your things, but they're going to be able to see that and also react to it. And the faster you go and the faster that combat happens, the further out you're going to have to be able to affect the combat itself. Which is very different if you're going at massively opposite velocities than if you're trying to have a meeting action. Let's go red. Make it a little bit easier for us. Team black, team red. Instead, if you are coming at relatively similar directions, right? Because you're still not necessarily trapped, but deeply influenced by those orbits. Right? So if you're coming up on a meeting direction, now you have a much longer type of a conflict, right? Conflict ends up much slower. It's like whenever you're driving a car and someone's driving like a half a mile an hour faster than you. They are going faster than you, but relatively, you're basically going the same speed. So really, there's only a difference of like a half mile an hour there. And that is a very different type of combat. So meeting each other, right, getting ships to meet each other, board each other, it's going to be a very different thing than passing attacks. And this is going to take place in a much faster environment than we're currently thinking of. But we also have this problem that while we are relatively on the same orbital plane, conflict doesn't inherently have to happen on that plane. Right? It doesn't have to happen on that same plane. There's actually a third dimension to it. So going up and over the plane of the ecliptic or under the plane of the ecliptic to get in, right, there is a third dimension. And of course, this all gets extra complicated by the fact that, well, the way that you view your environment is going to be dictated about where you are. So, right, we like to think of things in that kind of two-dimensional or maybe a little bit of a three-dimensional plane, but it's entirely relative to your own frame of reference. So the kinds of conflict that are going to be able, right, the kinds of conflict that are going to be able to emerge in space are going to be very heavily dictated by the frames of references of the combatants. The good example of this, don't know Ender's Game? Right, so Ender's Game, yeah, right. Once you decide on a direction, that's just what it is, because it's entirely relative in zero G. Right? Fighter pilots today have a limit on what they can do. It's not up also matters, but what happens if you turn the engines off on their plane? Falls to the earth. Right? Gravity's there. That there is no gravity in this combat. Unless you make the gravity for yourself via acceleration. So it's a different combat environment than we're inherently kind of trained to think. And it's one of those that you almost can't prepare yourself for it until you're in. So what does conflict look like in this realm? Well, if you want a good example, go watch The Expanse, because they're doing this great. I wasn't sure which one I wanted to pull up. I'm thinking I like the one at the end of Nemesis Games, but the problem is I tried pulling it up, and the TV wasn't working this morning before y'all came in. So basically, you have very fast passes, or it's almost like you're standing still, and it's just a difference in how fast you can accelerate with each other, right? Can you out-accelerate the other person's weapons? And then if you're actually the lead, right, if you're being chased and you're in that front one, you actually have a benefit to launch torpedoes backwards, because you get all their speed plus the speed of the torpedoes added to it, right? So it might look like you're essentially standing still, but then if you do something kinetically, right, launch something backwards, you actually have an advantage in that point. But then even when
it's like high-speed car chases kind of.
Yeah, but like in three dimensions,
Yeah.
and where there's no gravity, it's going to be really complicated, and conflict is going to be difficult, and especially in the cleanup after some sort of space battle, any debris, any weapons, anything that was loose is going to keep going the direction it's going, right? So how you end up looking at that in the long run, right? A space battle can actually end up denying an area indefinitely until you get the technology to be able to go clean it up. So that's a very different way of doing conflict than we're used to today. But why do you do all of this, right? It's fun to think about this because spaceships fight each other, makes for good TV. But what you have to remember is that ultimately, conflict doesn't really happen for conflict's sake. It happens to achieve a goal that you have. Be that resources, be that, well, really it probably boils down to resources more times than anything else. But you don't fight just to fight. Right? You have to have some sort of reason. Right? And the cost of doing conflict in space can be extraordinarily high, all the way up to the point of ending a civilization. Right? As much as I disagree with Dan Dudney and his idea that we shouldn't go into space because it's actually a civilizational risk, the only reason for that is conflict in space involves throwing asteroids, which is a civilization killer. That part I kind of have to give him that, but I don't think it's a big enough reason not to do it. But it's on the table, right? It is something that ends up being on the table. So if our ultimate goal is to expand humanity's presence throughout the solar system and beyond, to make humanity a multiplanetary species, does that goal end up creating more risk of it actually destroying humanity overall? And I don't know. But I do think that is a point worth thinking about. So yeah, what does conflict in space look like? If you really want to see what kind of fusion-powered space conflict looks like, go watch The Expanse. They actually took, like the producers took their stuff to the people that think about space combat for the military. They're like, yeah, this is pretty much exactly how it would look. Although they do have sound, which bothers me, but take that part away, and that's what it looks like. Ships throwing things, those things maintain their direction and maintain their velocity because unless something gets in the way, and relative velocities are really the thing that's going to dictate the way combat plays out. So yeah, remember, combat serves political goals. War is the continuation of politics by other means. And just because humans leave Earth doesn't mean we're not going to need to do that politics. The question becomes, how do you actually do conflict, which is going to be dictated by the technologies that you have. Thoughts? Questions? Comments, concerns? That's really all I have for today. That's like content for the semester, right? So we started this semester off with the idea that we might actually can, in the near future, set a civilization on Mars and in space. And what does that look like? Right? How does that civilization develop? We brought in a whole bunch of social science stuff to center it, ask questions, get some answers. And then ultimately, right, if we're going to be setting up multiple instances of humanity, there is an inherent risk of conflict. But that conflict is dictated by the technology that we have. So I think we kind of took it full circle, right? From leaving Earth to how do Earth and Mars fight each other in the end? Do you feel like you got some good political science stuff in here throughout the course of the semester? The whole idea is, well, one, from just a practical perspective, to think about these questions, but also to think about the way, right, taking political science outside of the context we're used to it in, and let us interrogate just the way that we approach it as well. That's kind of why I wanted to do it. That's kind of my value proposition for y'all. Plus, I mean, how many other places on Earth today can you actually learn about the politics of space? There's like 3. Maybe. And I'm being generous with 2 of them. You do to George Washington, but that's about it. And then they only do Earth and Earth orbit stuff. So there you go. All right. So Wednesday we are going to present our papers. Right, just where we're at. You don't have to have PowerPoint or anything. We're just going to kind of talk about If you want to have PowerPoint do a full presentation, that's okay as well. But I think we're good enough just sitting around and talking about what we did, right? Grad seminar style. Plus, that TV and the Mac is very unreliable, so I wouldn't lean on PowerPoint too heavily. If you have a draft of your paper, I will see that up until Saturday of this week. We've been a little lax on the summaries the last 2 weeks. If y'all get those in, I'll grade them without a penalty. The last two of them, no one turned one in at all.
I thought that was confusing because the summary 10, I was trying to figure out what week was that, and I thought that was for this week.
Yeah, 10 should be for this week, but 9 was for.
Yeah,
Or 11. Yeah, and it's okay, right? It's on all of us. This is also my problem. That's why I'm being very generous. Make sure you get those in. Otherwise, I do think y'all's outlines look really good. I think they're going in the right directions. I'm interested in these papers. I think they're going to be good. And I'm interested in seeing the final version of Bill's Constitution. It seems y'all would build pretty heavily on the U.S., but there's some good reasons for that as well. I want to see the tweaks that y'all made and how things worked out there. So that's what we've got going on. That's the semester. That's your content. It's been a pleasure. This is the second time now I've taught this. First time I've taught it after I wrote the book, and it was good. So appreciate you all. And I will see y'all on Wednesday. Cool. Yeah.
In my paper, can I have like subtitles to like kind of, I don't want to say section off, kind of.
Subheadings?
Yeah.
Yeah. You definitely have subheadings. Yes, absolutely.